start off with the external nose. We already know the nose is part of the respiratory system, and it is responsible to aid us in olfaction, so smelling, in respiration, filtration of dust. This individual actually does not have very hairy nostrils. That is different in many other individuals, especially in men, especially in aging men. Well, in addition to that, these hairs actually would help for the filtration of dust. Humidification of the inspired air is very important. This is why we actually have several shelves that actually arc into the inside of the nasal cavity. These are called conchae or turbinates. We'll see them a little bit later on. And of course, there is also the reception and elimination of secretions from the nasal mucosa, the paranasal sinuses, and the nasolacrimal ducts that open fairly deep into the nasal cavity, into a region called the inferior nasal meatus. So the external nose, as we can see here, is kind of a hallmark feature or a very individual and a very unique distinguishing feature of us humans. Mainly the difference in size is largely due to the different size and shape, of course, of the nasal cartilages. The dorsum of the nose, which we can see up here, extends from its superior angle along the root of the nose all the way to the apex of the nose, and on the inferior surface of the nose we have these two openings, which are the nostrils or nares, or even you may call them nasal apertures. The lateral boundary of these, yes, of course, this also has a name. These are called the ala, or wings. Ala means wing. And the two halves of the nose on the inside are actually going to be separated by the nasal septum. We're going to have to remove some more tissue layers until we can really see that. So now we've removed a lot of the soft tissue structures. We can now have a look at what are actually the bony parts of the nose. And that would actually be our nasal bones. There are two of those. There's the frontal process of the maxilla, which is this region of the maxilla. The nasal part of the frontal bone, and the bony part of the nasal septum, for which we'd have to dive into here. And this part of the bony part of the nasal septum is called the vomer, for instance, and this one is called the ethmoid bone. Actually, this part of the ethmoid bone would be the perpendicular plate. We'll have some more details as we move along. And apart from bone, of course, the nose has a lot of cartilage associated with it as well. So we're going to have two lateral cartilages, we're going to have two alar cartilages, and we're going to have a septal cartilage. And here we go. Here is our septal cartilage. As you can already see now, the entire inside of the nasal cavity is going to be lined with mucosa. And this is very important because this mucosa is always held moist. And also we can see here are these shelves or these conchae that are arching in and overlapping with each other a little bit. You have three of those. You have the inferior one, the biggest one down here. Then you have a middle one. Let me see if I can get it. Yep, here's the middle one. And then even higher up, it'll probably be hard to show with the software right now, there's going to be a superior nasal concha as well. And these three shelves are there to help increase the surface area for our nasal cavity. So here we get to have a look at the olfactory bulbs in a little bit more detail. We now have a magnified view of the olfactory bulb, which is in vivo, of course, located on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, sitting right on top of the cribriform plates. So you have one cribriform plate on the left and one on the right. In between is this bony structure, the crista galli. Interestingly, if I click on these little labels here, you can see that the olfactory bulb is actually going to be covered by pia, arachnoid, and dura. So all three meninges, just like the brain itself. If I flip this around, we can see a little bit more detail of this here. And it also highlights the fact that the olfactory bulb is going to be the point where the olfactory nerve bundles will terminate and their central processes are going to coalesce. The olfactory nerve fibers, so we can see going superiorly here, to their respective sensory olfactory neurons, they're going to originate down here on this layer of sensory epithelium. which is olfactory epithelium, and it's covered in mucus. So if I click on here, you can see it's highlighted in green. That is the mucus covering the olfactory epithelium, and it is secreted by these mucus glands that we can see here. If we follow the olfactory bulbs posteriorly, that will be this end, then we can see that the olfactory tract, which would start right here at the posterior margin of the olfactory bulb. So this olfactory tract is going to run in parallel and on either side of the midline posteriorly, where it's then going to bifurcate and penetrate the brain as the olfactory striae. We're going to keep the details of the olfactory bulb to a minimum, as the lecture here is going to focus just on the gross anatomy of the nasal cavity. There are many more details for you if you click on the little icons. If you click on the labels within your software, you can click on a label and expand it, and it'll give you much more information here. So in a nutshell about the function of the olfactory bulb, you probably know that the olfactory bulb is going to be fundamental to the process of smelling or olfactory transduction. It'll receive its neuronal signals about odorants via little odorant molecules that are going to be detected here by the olfactory sensory neurons. So that they can be detected, they actually have to first get absorbed into the mucosa, and then they're going to bind to these odor binding proteins, which are within the mucosal layer of the olfactory epithelium. And once you have odorant molecules bound to their cognate receptor proteins, the information about this odorant is going to be encoded and subsequently transmitted to the olfactory bulb via the axons of the olfactory neurons. And this processing of the different odor molecules actually makes it possible for us to differentiate between different odors. So now I've made us a hemisected head that's supposed to help us illustrate the extent of the nasal cavity and also the differences between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Okay, so the nasal cavity technically will extend from the cranial cavity superiorly, which is up here of course, to the palate inferiorly. So here's your hard palate, and the soft palate would be posterior to that because, well, it's actually made up of muscle and, well, tendinous or fibrous structures. The oral cavity will then extend from the palate superiorly to the mylohyoid muscle inferiorly, which is the muscle that goes perpendicular here. It's perpendicular to the direction of the anterior digastric and the geniohyoid. And then we have posteriorly here where the larynx is, and do not ever make the mistake to say larynx. There is no reason to call this thing larynx, but especially in the south of the United States, some people do make that mistake. So the larynx extends from the epiglottis, which is up here, all the way down to the cricoid cartilage, which is right here. The pharynx itself is going to be divided into three parts. There's the nasopharynx, which is basically the portion of the pharynx that you can see from here, which is the pharynx behind the nasal cavity. Then you have the oropharynx, and you probably already can tell that is the region behind the oral cavity, the oropharynx. And then of course the laryngopharynx, which is behind the larynx, so it is a little bit further down here. So the pathway for air would be entering the nose through the nostril or nares. We can see if we can kind of like go in here with the camera. You can see we are going to go past the nasal mucosa. This is where a lot of the humidification and the cleaning of the air happens. We don't have any hairs in this model, but there would actually also be hairs in here. So you'd actually have the nasal cavity, and then let me zoom out a little bit. From the nasal cavity, let's turn this around into the region of the nasopharynx and have a look again here at the size of these shelves, the turbinates or conchae. See how far they actually protrude into the nasal cavity. Now just imagine a stream of air flowing over and under these conchae. Here's the superior, here's the middle, here's the inferior. How much that actually helps in providing extra surface area. Okay, so then you have the air flowing from the nasopharynx down past the oropharynx, And this is where shared pathway, just a very short part of the shared pathway for food and air is. Then down through the laryngopharynx, through the larynx, well, here's the larynx, and into the trachea. And so here's our critical little switchover place. So these are our vocal cords or vocal folds, right? So we have two tubes. We have one tube that is always going to be patent. Well, that's going to be our trachea. That makes sense. That is right here. And we have our esophagus right here. So we need to have a little switcherovsky here, which is going to be in form of the epiglottis. When we swallow a bolus of food, the epiglottis will close shut and prevent this food from entering our airway. Yeah, when that actually misfires, that's when we actually have a coughing fit because we are choking, right? But that luckily rarely happens. So here's the epiglottis. When we swallow something, this would actually shut over the opening of the trachea, because the trachea, begins right down here, and the esophagus is just posterior to it. Remember that the esophagus is, although it is a tube, it is a muscular tube. And unless you are currently like eating a bolus of food and swallowing something, it's not really going to be very dilated or distended. That also makes it harder to find on, well, x-rays, unless you use for instance, a barium sulfate swallow to have a look at it. Here is your esophagus, here is your trachea. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit further. Now we can see a little bit more of your esophagus posteriorly, and here is your, well, the beginning of your trachea anteriorly. This is actually just all your laryngeal mucosa, and if we were then to fly with the camera into here, we would see the trachea and all the tracheal rings come past us. If we then go even further down, this is actually an interesting view as well. This is the bifurcation of the trachea, usually at the level of T4-5, the T4-5 IV disc, and this region is called the carina. And then you have here the esophagus behind there. The anterior wall of the nasal cavity will be formed by the pair of nasal bones. I only have half of a skull here, so clearly there's only one, and also be formed by the nasal apertures. And the posterior nasal wall, we turn everything around like this, is going to be formed by the body of the sphenoid bone. Remember here, the sphenoid looks a little bit like a butterfly in its shape, and here's the body. So the posterior wall will form the body, or actually the body will be formed by the posterior wall, and also these openings here, which are called the choana, they are part of the posterior walls of the nasal cavity. The roof of the nasal cavity is going to be divided into three parts, which would be the frontonasal, ethmoidal, and sphenoidal parts. And it's actually named after the three bones that it is made from. Here, so back here is the ethmoid bone. Specifically, actually, it's going to be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Then you have the sphenoid, and last but not least, you have the nasal bone over here. The floor of the nasal cavity is going to be a little bit wider than the roof, and it'll be formed by the palatine process of the maxilla, which we can see just about here, and the horizontal part of the palatine bone, which is back here. The medial wall of the nasal cavity, so the one that divides the left and right nasal cavities technically, is going to be formed by the nasal septum. The main components of this are going to be your nasal septal cartilage, also the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and the vomer. In addition to that, you also have the nasal crests of the palatine bone and the nasal crest of the maxillary bone indicated here. The lateral wall of the nasal cavity is fairly uneven because of the nasal conchae, which are these bony shelves that protrude into the nasal cavity. You have a superior nasal concha right up here. You have a middle nasal concha, and you have an inferior nasal concha. So these are obviously three elevations that project into the nasal cavity a little bit like scrolls. And so as the conchae curve inframedially, each of these will kind of form a roof. See, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that they form a roof-like structure. And so the region that is below that roof can be called a meatus. And so we have a superior, a middle, and an inferior meatus. And they are interesting things that open into the different meatuses. Just as an example, we have opening into the inferior meatus, the nasolacrimal duct or nasolacrimal canal. We have an opening into the maxillary sinus. Actually, in life there's something called the semilunar hiatus, and that will open into the maxillary sinus, but also have an opening to the frontal sinus, which we will find right up here. So the frontal sinuses in vivo will actually empty into the middle meatus via a duct called the frontonasal duct. We also have so-called ethmoid air cells, anterior, middle, and posterior. These are basically small sinuses that include several small cavities, as here the anterior, middle, and posterior ones. And of course they have to drain somewhere too, so the anterior one is going to drain directly or indirectly into the middle meatus through a structure called the infundibulum. The middle ethmoid air cells open directly into the middle meatus, and the posterior ethmoid air cells actually will open into the superior meatus. The largest of all the paranasal sinuses is, however, the maxillary sinus, as we will soon get to appreciate.